is how we remember JonBenét Ramsey, a beautiful pageant princess who charmed everyone she met. But whatever happened to the other girls who shared the stage with JonBenét 20 years ago? These women belong to the class of JonBenét, and they still live in her shadow to this day.
I remember her personality. I remember the spunk she had on stage.
Thumper Gosney competed with JonBenét for the title of Little Miss Sunburst 1996.
In the shadowy corridors of one of America's most haunting mysteries, three chilling revelations emerge from the depths of Burke Ramsey's childhood interrogations. Revelations that would forever alter how we understand the complexities of human emotion in the face of unspeakable tragedy. The poker face, watching his own tape, 20 years of silence, shattered in a single moment. In 2016, Burke Ramsey sat before Dr. Phil McGraw, confronted for the first time with footage that had remained buried since those dark December days of 1996. The weight of 2 decades pressed down upon the studio as these never-before-seen tapes flickered to life, revealing secrets that law enforcement had guarded with fierce determination. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. For 20 years, these recordings had remained locked away in the Boulder Police Department's evidence vault, their contents known only to a select few investigators and child psychologists who had sworn oaths of silence. The mere existence of these tapes had become the stuff of legend among true crime enthusiasts and legal experts, their mysterious contents feeding countless theories and wild speculation. Now, in the harsh glare of television studio lights, America would finally witness what had been hidden from view for so long. The footage unveiled a 9-year-old boy, just 13 days after his sister's death, sitting across from a child psychologist at the Boulder Police Department, a meeting shrouded in clinical detachment and eerie calm. The sterile walls of that interview room had witnessed countless interrogations, but none quite like this. Here was a child whose world had been torn asunder, yet who appeared to navigate the conversation with an unsettling composure that would haunt investigators for years to come. The timing of this interview was itself deeply significant. 13 days, barely 2 weeks had passed since JonBenét's body had been discovered in the basement of the Ramsey home. In those 13 days, the investigation had consumed Boulder, transforming a quiet college town into the epicenter of a media frenzy that showed no signs of abating. The national press had descended like locusts, satellite trucks lined the streets, and the Ramsey family had become prisoners in their own community. Yet here sat Burke, seemingly untouched by the chaos swirling around him, displaying a level of emotional control that would have been remarkable in an adult, let alone a child who had just lost his sister under the most traumatic circumstances imaginable. Burke remembered the room with startling clarity, but claimed complete ignorance about the psychologist's true role, a detail that would later fuel endless speculation about what else he might have misunderstood or deliberately obscured. The very fact that these tapes had been kept from public view for 2 decades spoke to their explosive potential, their ability to reshape public perception of the case that had captivated America. Law enforcement officials had gone to extraordinary lengths to protect these recordings, understanding intuitively that their release could either vindicate the Ramsey family or destroy them completely. The interview itself represented a carefully choreographed dance between professional obligation and family protection. Child psychologists specializing in trauma had been brought in specifically to assess Burke's mental state and determine what, if anything, he might know about the events of that terrible night. These were not casual conversations, but highly structured evaluations designed to penetrate the psychological defenses of a child who had already demonstrated an unusual ability to compartmentalize his emotions. Yet it was the leaked observations that sent shockwaves through the investigation, reverberating through media outlets and online forums with devastating impact. Unusual that he felt safe, that he showed little warmth towards the family, that he displayed an enormous lack of emotion and almost an indifference. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, painting a portrait of a child who seemed untouched by the horror that had consumed his family. These clinical assessments, cold in their professional detachment, described behavior that defied every expectation of how a grieving brother should respond. The psychological evaluation had noted additional troubling details that would later emerge in court documents and investigative reports. Burke's difficulty in opening up about his family dynamics, his apparent emotional distance from the trauma that had devastated his parents, his remarkable composure in discussing events that should have left him shattered. All of these observations painted a picture of a child whose psychological responses fell far outside the normal range of grief reactions. Normal range of grief reactions. The CBS documentary would later seize upon these observations with relentless focus, beginning what the lawsuit would term their assault on Burke by dissecting every frame, every expression, every micro gesture for signs of guilt or deception. Pseudo-experts emerged from the shadows, claiming to detect sinister meanings in a child's posture, in his failure to display appropriate grief, in his apparent comfort within that sterile interview environment. They would analyze the 911 call with similar intensity, suggesting Burke's voice could be heard in the background, contradicting his parents' claims that he had been asleep throughout the ordeal. When confronted about his seemingly unbothered demeanor during the Dr. Phil interview, Burke's explanation only deepened the mystery, creating more questions than answers. He spoke of being very emotional at the Fernies, of crying randomly out of nowhere, painting a picture of private grief that stood in stark contrast to his public composure. His attribution of the interview behavior to sitting with a weird guy he'd never encountered, answering invasive questions while processing the natural need to eventually stop crying and move forward, revealed a compartmentalization that seemed almost too sophisticated for a 9-year-old mind. Most disturbing was Burke's reflection on watching himself as a child, his assessment that he looked like a normal kid, his suggestion that his reserved personality explained the clinical observations. This retrospective analysis, delivered with the same emotional distance that had characterized his childhood responses, suggested that whatever mechanisms had allowed him to navigate that original interview remained firmly in place decades later. The adult Burke seemed as emotionally detached from his childhood trauma as the 9-year-old Burke had been from his sister's death, a consistency that would either vindicate his claims of innocence or provide the most damning evidence against him. But three haunting questions emerged from this revelation. The concept of maintaining a poker face during such a devastating family tragedy raises fundamental questions about appropriate emotional responses. When a sibling has perished under such circumstances, the expectation of emotional restraint or attempting to appear tough seems fundamentally misplaced. This is precisely the time when vulnerability and genuine emotion would be most natural and expected. The focus should be entirely on seeking justice for the deceased sibling, not on presenting a controlled facade to the world. While there is certainly no obligation to display private grief publicly, and personal breakdown time should remain private, the complete absence of visible emotional response creates an unsettling disconnect. The stone-faced presentation during such a critical time appears incongruous with the gravity of the situation and the natural bonds expected between siblings. The characterization of law enforcement personnel as weird presents significant logical inconsistencies when examined closely. If Burke felt comfortable speaking with a psychologist whom he didn't even realize was a psychologist at the time, it becomes puzzling why trained police officers would suddenly seem strange or off-putting. The police officers were clearly identified as law enforcement, and their purpose was transparent. They were there to investigate and catch whoever was responsible for what happened. In contrast, the psychologist represented an unknown entity asking personal questions about feelings regarding his sister's death, yet this interaction apparently didn't register as uncomfortable or weird. The selective application of the weird label to police officers, while not extending the same characterization to the unidentified psychologist, suggests an inconsistent interpretation of these professional interactions that doesn't align logically with the circumstances. Most chilling of all, the expressed desire to get on with life represents perhaps the most troubling aspect of Burke's recorded responses. Even acknowledging that this statement came from a young child, the retrospective view from his adult perspective at age 29 offers an opportunity for clarification or recontextualization that was never taken. Rather than explaining this statement as childish misunderstanding or providing context about what he might have meant, Burke allowed the statement to stand without qualification or explanation. This desire to move on, both as a child and apparently as an adult, seems fundamentally at odds with what would be expected regarding a sibling's death. The concept of truly moving on from such a loss seems impossible for most people, as it represents the kind of trauma that permanently alters one's life perspective. The ongoing nature of such grief means it surfaces randomly throughout life, even after the acute crying phase has passed, making the expressed desire for normalcy and forward movement particularly concerning in its apparent finality. Natural detachment or blunted affect. The sources paint competing portraits of Burke's emotional landscape. Was his detachment the natural response of an introverted child or something far more sinister? This question would become the fulcrum upon which the entire case would turn, dividing experts, investigators, and the public into warring camps of interpretation. Patsy Ramsey described her son as introspective and quiet, often seemingly indifferent or distant when under intense pressure, noting that while she and JonBenet possessed the extrovert gene, Burke remained perpetually in the shadows of their family dynamic. This characterization painted Burke as the family's quiet observer, the child who processed the world internally, while his sister commanded attention with her pageant performances and vivacious personality. The contrast between the siblings had been stark even in life. JonBenet, the golden child who thrived in spotlights, and Burke, who seemed most comfortable when invisible. But Patsy's description carried darker undertones that she perhaps didn't fully appreciate. The phrase seemingly indifferent or distant when under intense pressure suggested a pattern of emotional disconnection that extended far beyond typical introversion. Most introverted children, when faced with family crisis, still demonstrate clear emotional investment in their loved one's well-being. True introversion involves internal processing of emotions, not the apparent absence of them entirely. The clinical detachment that Burke displayed seemed to transcend normal personality variations, entering territory that mental health professionals might classify as concerning. The family dynamics themselves told a complex story of roles and expectations that may have shaped Burke's responses. In the Ramsey household, emotional expression seemed to follow traditional gender lines. Patsy and JonBenet were the expressive ones, the performers, the ones who wore their hearts on their sleeves. Burke, perhaps influenced by his father's more reserved nature, had learned early that emotional restraint was not only acceptable, but potentially preferable. This learned behavior could explain his responses, or it could mask something far more troubling. Patsy insisted Burke was simply in shock, that forced circumstances made talking frightening enough for a child already struggling to hold it together and be strong for his grieving parents. This explanation reveals the enormous burden that may have been placed on Burke's young shoulders. Not only was he expected to process his own trauma, but he was apparently tasked with providing emotional support to adults who should have been protecting him. The reversal of roles, where a 9-year-old becomes the emotional caretaker for devastated parents, suggests a family system under extreme stress. His therapist, Dr. Jaffe, proclaimed Burke was fine, that children simply handle things differently than adults. This professional assessment would become crucial in the family's defense strategy, but it also raised questions about the thoroughness of Burke's psychological evaluation. How extensive were these sessions? What specific assessment tools were used? Were there standardized measures of childhood trauma response that Burke's reactions were compared against? The brevity of this professional opinion, reduced to children handling things differently, seemed inadequate given the magnitude of the family's crisis. Burke himself claimed the media frenzy had transformed him into a very private person, that their lives had been made crazy for far too long. This self-assessment suggested an adaptive response to extraordinary circumstances, a child learning to protect himself from public scrutiny by withdrawing into emotional isolation. The media attention had indeed been relentless, with reporters camping outside their home, following them to school and church, turning their private tragedy into public entertainment. For a naturally introverted child, this level of invasion could have been psychologically devastating. He simply wanted to grow up like a normal kid, rather than becoming another spectacle for television cameras. This desire for normalcy would become a recurring theme in Burke's public statements, but it also highlighted the impossible position he found himself in. There was no returning to normal after what had happened. JonBenet was gone, their family was forever changed, and the media attention showed no signs of abating. Burke's insistence on normalcy in such abnormal circumstances could be seen as either healthy resilience or troubling denial. When critics suggested his lack of curiosity stemmed from already knowing what happened, Burke's response was bone-chilling in its simplicity. He was not the worried type and simply doesn't want to know what's going on. This statement would haunt the case for decades, representing either the ultimate expression of childhood self-protection or the most damning evidence of his involvement. Most children, faced with their sister's disappearance and death, would be consumed with questions, desperate to understand what happened and why. Burke's apparent indifference to these fundamental questions defied normal psychological expectations. Reading the silence, personality, or concealment. The final piece of this psychological puzzle centers on a question that has tormented investigators for decades. Should Burke's emotional void be interpreted as mere personality quirk or calculated concealment? The CBS documentary seized upon Burke's responses like vultures circling carrion, using his lack of emotion, lack of curiosity, and alleged secrets as damning evidence. When Burke admitted he probably had secrets but couldn't remember them and wouldn't tell if he could, expert James Clemente proclaimed that trained child interview specialists should know that the most important things are the things that people tell children are secrets. But law enforcement tells a different story. Detective Fred Patterson, who interviewed Burke on December 26, 1996, concluded the boy had no idea or knowledge about what happened. Dr. Suzanne Bernhard reached the same conclusion after her January 8, 1997 psychological evaluation. Both the Boulder PD and Child Social Services remained convinced from their early interviews that Burke neither knew what happened nor witnessed his sister's death. The documentary's pseudo-experts allegedly manipulated Burke's behavior, showing him demonstrating how JonBenet might have been killed, highlighting his failure to ask Detective Patterson questions as evidence of guilt. They emphasize that Burke doesn't seem to be concerned at all and exhibits no appropriate emotion. The Ramsey defense team fired back with fury, claiming the documentary purposefully avoided and ignored the overwhelming evidence that established that Burke did not kill his sister and recklessly disregarded verifiable denials from Burke, his family, and law enforcement. John Andrew Ramsey reminded the world that there is no handbook on how to act when you're going through the loss of a child, yet 3 final mysteries refuse to be silenced. The discussion of secrets reveals the nuanced challenge of interpreting childhood responses during investigations. While the principle of not revealing secrets is generally appropriate and expected, the manner of communication and nonverbal cues can provide additional context that may be significant. The way someone responds when asked about secrets, particularly their demeanor and body language, can indicate whether they are referring to general childhood secrets or something more specific to the situation at hand. There is an important distinction between having typical childhood secrets about minor misbehavior or friend-related matters versus possessing knowledge about something more serious that has been designated as secret information. The communication style can sometimes convey whether the secret represents a barrier that prevents further discussion or inquiry, suggesting the presence of information that extends beyond normal childhood confidentiality. The absence of questions directed toward Detective Patterson during the investigation presents an unusual pattern that deserves examination. When a detective is conducting an interview about a missing sister, providing details about ransom demands and serious threats, the natural response would typically include questions about the investigation's progress what help might be needed, or concerns about the sister's welfare. The characterization of the situation as alternating between treating JonBenet as legitimately missing and then not missing creates confusion about the timeline and Burke's understanding of events as they unfolded. The lack of expressed curiosity about his sister's situation, when presented with information about the serious nature of the circumstances, represents a departure from expected behavioral responses during such interviews. Most damning, the assertion of overwhelming evidence supporting Burke's innocence must be weighed against the physical evidence that has been documented in the case. While attorneys naturally work to challenge credibility and defend their clients, the characterization of contradicting experts as pseudo-experts represents a legal strategy rather than a scientific evaluation. The physical evidence, including DNA and forensic analysis, has indicated the presence of fingerprints and genetic material from multiple family members on various items connected to the case, including objects and clothing associated with JonBenet. These findings have not received comprehensive explanations beyond general denials of involvement. The presence of multiple family members' fingerprints and genetic material in various locations connected to the crime scene raises questions that extend beyond simple denial, particularly when the expectation would be minimal contact if family members were genuinely uninvolved in the events of that evening. The enduring questions. In the end, Burke Ramsey remains an enigma wrapped in silence, his childhood responses frozen in time like exhibits in a museum of human behavior. Were his reactions the natural response of a traumatized, introverted child thrust into an impossible situation, or do they represent something far more calculated, a carefully constructed wall built to protect secrets too terrible to reveal? The truth lies buried somewhere in the intersection of psychology, forensic evidence, and human nature, a place where expert opinions clash like waves against jagged rocks, where family loyalty battles public scrutiny, and where the memory of a murdered child demands justice that may never come. 28 years later, the questions remain as haunting as ever. What did Burke Ramsey know? When did he know it? And perhaps most chilling of all, what secrets does he carry still? The truth may never be legally proven, but the shadows of that truth continue to darken everything they fall upon. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more storytelling analysis like this.